So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Malcolm Harbour. I'm an associate of the Connected Places Catapult, and it's my privilege to be chairing today's webinar in our Challenging Procurement series. And some of you may already have joined our series before, but we hope you will have a really interesting afternoon. And above all, we want you to make it your event as well. So if we just move on to the agenda, just to say what's going to happen over the next hour and a half. In a moment, you're going to hear an introduction from my colleague at Connected Places Catapult, Oliver Kirsch, introducing our guest speakers who are going to present to you. And then we'll then move into a discussion panel, which I will be chairing. And the really important thing about that is that we want your questions. On your Zoom screen, you will see the Q&A button. And please, from the beginning, start placing your questions on that, because I shall be following that closely, and I'll be putting your questions to our speakers and getting some discussion going. And by all means, during the speaker presentations, if you put questions, if there are some specific questions for either of our two distinguished guest speakers, then pose those questions as well, and I will pick them up. So I think without more ado then, until the discussion when I'll be back with you later, I'm now going to hand over to Oliver Kirsch to give us an introduction to the agenda today and to our speakers.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. So welcome to this session on the use of procurement to drive innovation in local transport services. As Malcolm said, my name is Oliver Kirsch. I am the Strategic Futures Team Lead here at Connected Places Catapult, and I'm the lead for our Challenging Procurement Programme, of which this series of webinars is one of our activities. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, if you don't know CPC, we are an innovation agency whose role is to foster innovation and help break down the barriers to market for small enterprises and innovators across the UK. And we have a focus, the Connected Places Catapult has a focus on placemaking sectors such as transport and the built environment. And in those sectors, particularly procurement is a facilitator of innovation. So that's the reason that we put together the Challenging Procurement Programme in the first place, with the aim of supporting both public authorities and innovation supply side. For reference, this session about local transport services, is slightly more specific than some of the previous ones that we've run in this series, where we're trying to provide some more specific, tangible support, or the beginnings of that. We will continue through this ongoing series to address the policy agenda, but we want to serve both roles. So before we move on to more detail, Nick, if we could just pop up the first poll, please. This is a good time for us to get to know you, the audience, a little, please. So there are two quick questions here, just asking about the type of organisation that you work within and your role within that. It just helps our speakers tailor the content of their presentations, and when we move into the discussion, to think about how we can best give you the right information. So I'll give you a moment to populate those. And then Nick, maybe if we can just pop up the results. So that's quite a nice, simple one. So very interesting, very appropriate for this session. So looks like around half of our attendees are working in local or regional government, which hopefully should mean that the information that we're going to get into details is very appropriate for you. And we have a good mix of procurement professionals and people in the supply side as well. So that's really helpful to know. Thank you very much, and we'll bear that in mind as we progress on. So Nick, if you hop to the next slide. As Malcolm mentioned on the previous slide, so that the agenda, the structure of this session is that we will have each of our speakers present for about 10 minutes, talking about some of the work that we've done previously or recently in this space, and then we will open out into panel discussions. For that purpose, if you can put any questions that occur to you in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, just type any questions in there and we will use those to facilitate the discussion. So thank you for that. So the speakers that we have today for you are Darren Capes, who is the Intelligent Transport Systems Policy Lead at the Department of Transport and is a fellow at both the Institute for Highway Engineers and the Institute for Engineering and Technology. Darren has over 30 years experience within local and central government, and as a qualified civil engineer, his current role has moved into, he leads the ITS policy at the FT and focuses on supporting local authorities and engaging with the future of transport agenda and ensuring that the UK's road authorities are prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. And our second speaker today is Daniel Hobbs, who is the Principal Technologist and Team Lead in the New Mobility Technologies Directorate here at Connected Places Catapult, where he works to bring innovative technology solutions into the transport arena. Dan has 30 years experience on the implementation of technology to support transportation, including supporting authorities in the procurement of innovative technology services and solutions which range from anything from payment, information services, parking to traffic management systems. So it's very broad experience. They are who we will hear from. As I said, any questions in the Q&A section, and I guess without further ado, we move on to Darren, who's going to speak to us about the background to this work that we've been doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Right. No slides from me. You'll be pleased to know. Just a quick introduction to this session from my perspective in government. So I think it's very timely to run that little poll at the beginning there, because that gives me a bit of a feel for who we're speaking to. And I think it is a really pertinent audience. So basically, what I'd like to do is start by quoting a statistic that I often quote, that around 97% of England's road network is not under the ownership of national highways. It's under the ownership of local authorities, and there are 153 local highway authorities in England. So why is that relevant to this? Well, what that means is that the majority of technology that we buy for the highway network for road transport will be bought by local authorities. And because there are 153 of them, it will be bought by a wide range of authorities, from the very large, from the large counties, the large cities, the TfLs of this world, right down to the very small. There are some very small unitary authorities scattered around England that have highway powers that have very limited resources. So there's potentially a huge range of bodies involved in procuring technology, and a huge range of skills in procurement. And this raises a real challenge, because as we move into the future, we really want to ensure that all the boats rise at the same rate as the tide rises. In other words, we want every authority to adopt technology in the same way, both because that's exactly what we should be aspiring to, because that ensures that the benefits and new working arrangements and increased efficiencies of technology play out equally across the nation, but also because as drivers and transport users, we will expect a common quality of service across the country. And most people outside of the world of local government have no knowledge or interest in where local authority boundaries are, or whose local authority area they happen to be in. If they have a service that works on their mobile, in their vehicle, whatever, they expect that to work nationally. They expect it to work consistently around the country. So there's a very strong desire in government to ensure that we set guidance to enable everybody to be able to procure technology. Now that raises a number of challenges, because most local authorities don't buy technology, and certainly don't buy innovation regularly. Now, most local authorities have a procurement team, and that procurement team will be very well versed in using the regulations to procure things. But the things they generally procure are the things that councils buy a lot of: pens, pencils, toilet roads, road salt. The things that local authorities buy for schools, for highway maintenance, for daycare centres, for libraries. They're not versed widely with buying innovation. They're not versed in using innovative approaches to procurement to buy stuff. That's not their day job. That makes it more difficult for engineers in local authorities and for policymakers in local authorities to be able to do that, to be able to sell to their procurement section how to buy innovation, and how to do in a minimal risk way. We are generally spending public money. It's incumbent on us to do that in a low risk way, but it's also incumbent on us to do it in a way that fully understands risks and understands the cost of risk and understands how you charge that and how you pay for that. So the guidance that we really need is twofold. It's guidance to understand what technology is and how the market should be approached, and the guidance to understand how the existing rules we have can be used to undertake that type of activity. Now, many people will tell you that the European guidance is that you have to go to tender, you have to get 3 quotes, or you have to go to full open tender, or use some sort of framework. That's how you procure stuff, and that's not actually the case. There are lots of other alternative routes to procurement that are allowed under the European procurement guidance, and that are likely to continue to be allowed as that guidance is taken into UK law as we complete our exit from EU regulation. There are lots of alternative ways that most local authorities very rarely use that we can procure. We can procure using challenges. We can procure using negotiated dialogues. We can procure using processes that allow us to test products and to undertake research and pay for development. There are lots of different routes, and I'm not going to go into them today because that's not really my job. I don't think in this session. My job is to really highlight the fact that they exist, and it's important for us in government, and important for local authorities that as many people in local authorities as possible understand that, because this is how we will buy technology. And similarly, it's important for suppliers as well. It's important for suppliers to understand the ways in which local authorities do buy technology and the ways in which they may do in the future. It's important for them to understand how to sell their product, how to price their offerings, how to think about how they finance research and development, how they propose new and innovative solutions to local authorities. These are all things that we need to develop through improved guidance. Now, going forward, we are going to move from a world where local authorities generally own everything that they need to own to deliver the service. So if you imagine traffic signals, a local authority traditionally they own the road, they own the traffic signals, they probably own the communications back from that set of traffic signals. They own the full thing. In the future, that won't be the case. In the future, local authorities will have to work in partnership with many more providers. They will buy services that are hosted in the cloud. They will buy data. They will buy intelligence. They will buy modeling in per hour or per day costs. They will interrelate with other technologies providers in lots of new ways. That requires a completely new way of thinking about how you contract services, how you form agreements, how you work with other partners. This again is another challenge that we need to address. How do you work in this much more interlinked, much more service-driven world, a world where we are much more buying services than buying equipment, a world where the revenue costs of running a service are much more impactful than potentially than the capital cost of buying it? How do we deal with all those challenges? How do we get local authorities to do that? And how do you deal with it in a way that continues to protect public money, continues to ensure that we get best value for money for what is in effect our tax pounds? This is what local authorities are spending. It's my tax they're spending. So on the one hand, I want them to be innovative and think about new technologies. On the other hand, I don't want them wasting my tax money. How do we do that? And how do we ensure that to meet the government's aspiration to be the best place in the world to do digital transport, that everything moves forward together? And how do we ensure that increasingly, as we see services that need to be delivered across council boundaries, services that need to work at a regional level, services that potentially need to work in relationship with other neighbouring authorities, with national highways, with other bodies, how do we ensure that we're able to do that and buy services that interlink and work together, while still allowing each authority to be the master of its own destiny in terms of what it procures, how it procures it, what contracts and what financial obligations it signs up to? How do we manage that? How do we manage that mixture? If we move to a solution as we see in the Netherlands, where there are now national intelligent traffic services available to users under a project called Talking Traffic. If we applied that to the UK, how would that work? How would we apply common services for road users using connected vehicle technologies and data in a world of multitudes of different authorities of different sizes and capabilities? How would we ensure that that was delivered in a seamless way that still works within the existing frameworks of local authorities? So these are all the questions I expect to have fully answered within the next hour and a half, because I don't think it's beyond us to do that. No, seriously, we won't answer these questions today, but I think today is a real opportunity to continue to explore these problems. And the work that the Connected Places Catapult are doing around the manual for smart streets is an attempt to start to do that. It's an attempt to start to give people such as the job I used to do, managing transport in York, people doing that type of work in local authorities, give them the right tool set to be able to argue internally with their colleagues, be able to speak to their procurement people, be able to understand risk and build procurements, build projects in a way that will work best. And if Manual for Smart Streets can do that, if it can build that tool set for those kind of people, then I think it will have succeeded. And it will only succeed through this two-way discussion of understanding what people really perceive the problems are, what people really want us to deliver, what people expect these tools to do, how this guidance should fit in alongside other guidance that we see from people like the Commercial Service, the guidance that the Transport Technology Forum has produced on procurement, guidance coming out of other parts of government, guidance from people like the Geospatial Commission on buying geospatial data. These all need to be aligned in the same direction. And Manual for Smart Streets has a place to fit within that wider framework, within that wider environment. And I think events like this are really key to ensuring that we land it right and we produce the guidance that is important to people to allow them to procure technology, to procure innovation, and to deliver the type of transport services that we all expect for the future. So I think that really is the challenge, should you choose to accept it. I think that's really all I want to say now, just as an overarching view of what I think the problems are, what government thinks the problems are, and what we think we need to address to deal with that. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Darren. That's really interesting. There's a lot to pick apart in the discussion section there for sure. And certainly the discussion of the different innovation procurement mechanisms chimes with a lot of the conversations that CPC have held across the sector. On that subject, I guess I would encourage interested people to have a look at the challenging procurement section of the Connected Places website, where there are some materials and some reports that we've put together that touch upon that best practice in those areas. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Daniel Hobbs to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the recent work that we have done in this space.
Okay, afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Oliver, and thank you for the setting the scene there, Darren. I think we've got some slides, Nick. And just as a little bit more background on myself, I joined the Catapult 2 years ago. And before that, I'd worked with AECOM, the big engineering consultancies, for going on 20 years, helping local authorities largely in the procurement of all sorts of different intelligent transport systems. And for the final 2 years before I left there, I was working with the Traffic Infrastructure Ireland, buying the smart motorway system that they're putting around Dublin. And we were doing a negotiated competitive dialogue for that. And it took another year after I left for that. So 3 years before they actually awarded the contract. And a lot of that was because they didn't really know what they wanted in the first place. And so that's the kind of focus of what we're talking about with putting the manual of smart streets together, is understanding what the problem is. So if we could have the next slide, Nick. Just to put a little bit more weight around what Darren was saying about the pace of change. This kind of covers just slightly more than my 30-ish years in the industry. When I first started, I was working with peak traffic implementing Scoot systems, and a significant amount of changes have happened over the years. And a lot of that has been driven by the way that procurement has supported the different technologies to come into the marketplace and managing the risk and appropriate levels of risk through that process. But that's all above the line. Below the line there is all the other services that have been developing. And as Darren says, they changed the way that people expect to use information, expect to be able to access services, and expect to be able to get things delivered as they move around the network. And all of that is moving at a much faster pace than the procurement and services that the authorities have been putting in place. And we need to take that jump forward to catch up with that, really, in order to deliver a service that works for the public. So moving to the next slide. We kicking off the work on what is now the Manual for Smart Streets, we did a lot of engagement around understanding what the problems are. And we put together this life cycle that follows the process that people go through when they're procuring new technology. And a lot of it is about starting off with an understanding of the strategy, understanding what the benefits are, understanding whether there are suppliers in the network so you can make the right appropriate level of risk, and putting a strategy together, putting a specification together. And then people come to procurement. And a lot of what we're going to be saying in putting this guidance together is that right up the head of the process, when you're putting the high level needs together, that's the time to start with the procurement strategy. That's time to understand how you're going to actually buy the service or equipment or mix of service and equipment that you need to deliver your requirements. And starting right up the top with the procurement strategy allows the appropriate level of innovation procurement to be built in, allows the procurement team to understand what the needs are and how to work within the regulations to deliver the flexibility to meet the challenges. So the Manual for Smart Streets will then address each of these steps. So if we move forward into the final slide, Nick, what we've done is put together a set of guidance which addresses a whole range of different technologies that are used in what we're calling smart streets, from parking management, public transport, air quality, the whole range of technologies. And for each of those types of technologies, we'll provide a set of information that talks about each one of those stages on the life cycle that we're just looking at, and the types of things to think about there at each stage, the technical standards, the benefits structure, how to put the case together. Then that's all coming together into a set of documents, which is then supported by information and guidance about how to use it at each stage. That would be brought together into a complete manual for publish in the early new year. But at this stage, we're starting to publish the beta version on the TTF website. That's starting to move out there actually this week. So there'll be information starting to come through, and we're actively looking to get your engagement, to get your comments, to get the information back from you as to whether we're pressing the right buttons, whether we're providing the right information, whether additional details need to go in at different places. So really looking forward to this engagement. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Dan. That's really interesting, and hopefully the audience, much like myself, are looking forward to seeing what the guidance looks like as it goes up on the Transport Tech Forum website. So before we move into the full panel session, there's two things. Number one, please, if you have questions, add them to the Q&A section below. And in the meantime, there is a couple of questions that we wanted to ask you, just again to get a feel for your opinions. Thank you, Nick. So there's two questions here, which just kind of touch on help us to understand your appetite and your confidence working with these interesting innovation procurement mechanisms. So if you could just give us an indication of those things, we'd be really interested. And again, it will help us guide through the level of detail required for the next part of the discussion. So I'll give you a moment to fill those in, and then we will hand over to Malcolm to get into the discussion. So Nick, if we move to the results for this. Excellent. Well, first question, certainly an awful lot of appetite and appreciation for the importance. And I think that pays testament to the discussion that Darren and Dan just went through, and a real mix of confidence in approaching these tools, which we certainly understand there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of difference in mindset using innovation procurement approaches than, as Darren talked about, kind of bulk procurement approaches. So perhaps that will come out in the next section of the discussion. Thank you very much. So Malcolm, without further ado, if I hand over to you, we can move into the panel section. And Darren and Dan, if you can rejoin.
Good. So I think we're going to have. I think we'll have a screen with all of us on, will we? Shortly, I think. So the audience can see us all together, I hope, because I have a slide up at the moment. But in the meantime, I think Darren is still on the screen at the moment. So first of all, thank you very much for the presentations. The audience are a bit slow in putting up questions, so I'm going to pose some questions that for me have followed on very, very strongly from the discussion. And first of all, given that you've just seen on the poll that I think only about a quarter of the audience feel as if they're confident about using the procurement tools, I wanted to come back to what Darren was saying in his opening presentation about the fact that many of the authorities that you're dealing with are moving perhaps out of their comfort space in terms of procurement into procuring new technologies or new types of services for which they're not familiar. So I think my first question for Darren, well, for both of you really, but with Darren first, is in terms of information. I mean, how should we say government or you, and how should we be working with the customers in sort of preparing the ground for helping them to think about the way they're going to be placing these contracts and the way they're going to be working for suppliers? I mean, is that do we need to work on that interface? And if so, how are we going to do it? Darren.
I think we do. Yes, I think so. So to tell a little story, it's probably massively oversimplifies this. If I'm working in a local authority and I go to my procurement team, so as I said in my presentation, their job is generally to buy stuff, the kind of stuff that local authorities use, which are generally the kind of things you buy by going out to 3 suppliers or signing up to a framework, and off you go, you buy them and you get the best value, and we all know how to do that. If as an engineer I turn up and say I want to buy a cloud hosted data analytics service selling modeling by the process, and I want to buy it for a 2-year, you can imagine a very complex, innovative procurement possibility, then it's very hard to get the procurement team to understand what I want to buy. What we need is we need very good exemplar. We need very good case studies of people who have already done this. We need very simple rules to allow people like myself in that other role to be able to go and say, look, this is how we should do it. This is how others have done it. This is how we think about the risk of this. This is how the market is likely to respond to being asked to procure or to sell in this way. We need that kind of guidance. We need to think about. So for government, I think the challenge is around supporting exemplars and supporting authorities that do have a maybe slightly higher risk appetite than most to undertake this type of procurement, and then gather all the information and all the sort of all the understanding and knowledge that we can from that to be able to turn that into guidance for the majority of local authorities who don't have that risk appetite. Okay. And I think that's important. It's important to use exemplars as a way of showing, but both public and private sector exemplars, to show how this can work and how it can be delivered.
Okay. I want to come back to this question about types of procurement in a second, but just to ask Daniel, I mean, is this something that, because you had a really good a concept about the areas of technology that that local authorities should be engaging with. But can we add more? Will we be able to add some more guidance about the specific procurement tools to use to acquire those, do you think? Or is that going to be part of your package?
Absolutely. I mean, we can't provide a static set of guidance because the technology is going to keep changing as we deliver it. And new case studies need to be able to fit in as they demonstrate new ways of doing things. So the structure of the information that we're developing and the online publishing structure would enable that to continue to update and bring in new case studies as they arise.
We've got 3 questions in which I'll put to you in a moment, but just to sort of continue that line of discussion. I know that Crown Commercial Services, together with the Government Digital Service, have put together a procurement framework for digital companies to help them. So there was a sort of catalogue. I think it's called Spark, I think, if I'm right. I mean, is that the sort of tool that would help to simplify the interface? In other words, where the local authorities would have a group of suppliers in the technology domains that Daniel identified, and there will be a fairly familiar procurement process, because I think the Spark had identified a sort of competitive dialogue process, I think, as being the way to encourage customers to engage with them. I mean,
Yeah. I think so. I think we have to acknowledge that we should acknowledge the fact that we're not in virgin territory here. There are lots of initiatives going on out there, and I think part of this is about highlighting the good ones to local authorities, and so that with the breadth of local authorities out there means that some already do this, they already know this, some know more than we do about how to procure technology. A small number, the majority don't. I think part of our task is to be that kind of marriage broker and bring the authorities that need to do stuff and the initiatives that are out there, bring them together, so people can understand what is the best solution for individual procurement challenges. I think I would also just like to quickly add to that. I think there is another side of this, which is I think a lot of suppliers, certainly the suppliers that don't regularly deal with local authorities, are naive when it comes to how you sell to public bodies and the constraints they face and the legal requirements they have. And I think another part of this really is about educating certainly SMEs and new entrants into the local authority procurement about how you sell to local authorities and what the immovable objects in that piece are that you really need to understand as a supplier.
I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, Daniel, what do you think? Is that something that you can incorporate or will be able to incorporate in this package, do you think?
Absolutely. I think that the guidance will be very useful to suppliers as well. I mean, it is essential for new suppliers coming into this field to understand the constraints that the local authorities are under, and the way that they have to work, and the way that the sales process to an authority is very different from the sales process to another private company.
Now, I mean, there are some more detailed questions moving away from procurement, but since we have one on procurement, I'll put that question now, which really links on to what we've said. But Mr. A.N. Schrijvers, I think I pronounced his name because that's what's come up on my question as he's registered. Particularly, it was directed at Daniel, but I think for both of you, because he's asking about competitive dialogue. Would you recommend a competitive dialogue as a starting place? And do you have some experience in using it? And are there any particular issues about moving into a competitive dialogue? And I think maybe, and this is a point I would add, for local authorities who aren't necessarily so familiar or having done many of these processes. Who wants to take that? Daniel, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, my experience has been both from bidding for and from managing the process. And I think it works well when, for specific cases, when the scale of what is being procured is enough that the costs of the process are covered. Because it is an expensive process. There is a lot of going backwards and forwards. There is a lot of changes. And often the way that risk is managed is by getting a lot of lawyers involved, which is putting a load of fancy words around the technical problem rather than actually trying to understand what the technical problem is and bring that up front into the dialogue.
But I think you made the point, I think, that, or maybe both of you made the point, that it was really important for the procurement team to be involved with their end customers from the very beginning. In other words, the transport specialists who want a new application should bring the procurement team right at the very beginning That's something from my work with the LGA that came through strongly. And I'm just wonder whether your experience was that this wasn't happening enough, or is the transport are the transport specialists more eager to plan their procurement alongside their specification work?
Well, I think that there's often the case where some of the development of the idea has happened, and then they go along to procurement and say, okay, we want this, and that's at that point it's too late, because you're having that conversation like Darren was illustrating earlier on the cloud operating modeling system, rather than trying to start from the point of view of whether you have the structure for a service procurement or a buying a thing procurement, and building the process around what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Daniel, is there something? Yeah, and I was going to ask Daniel if he wants to comment, Darren, if he wants to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think just to go back to this point about competitive dialogue, I think as Daniel said, it does have a place, but it is risky, it's expensive, and the outcomes can be hard to predict sometimes. I think before you think about using competitive dialogue and other similar approaches, there's possibly a need for a real culture shift inside local authorities, and this picks up on something that Daniel's just been saying about. And technologists and engineers often very quickly move to solutioneering. They very quickly move to thinking about the solution they want to buy. Before you can effectively employ things such as a competitive dialogue, you need to get into the mindset of thinking about the service you want to deliver, the outcomes you want to achieve, the way you'll measure success, because that's the way you should approach it. Not saying we know the exact shape and size of the box we want to buy. Let's go and start a competitive dialogue. So it isn't something you can just deploy. It does need a real reshaping of how local authorities approach procurement. And again, that's very much about involving procurement services very early, while solutions and the like are being developed, rather than the traditional, we are the engineers, we know what needs prescribing, we'll go and buy it approach.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that's an extremely important lesson, and it actually ties in with Sir Oliver Coltman, who's been my most assiduous questioner so far. So thank you, Oliver. So we'll try and bring some of them in. But it just segues in exactly into what Darren was talking about, which is the importance of not over-prescribing the solutions to the problem that you have. In other words, really working on that problem definition, the unmet needs that you're looking to fill. Now, I mean, his point is that that clearly requires a lot of detailed knowledge and experience from the buyer, with history of prior collaborations and so on. But he's worried that that can't be done within the current procurement regulations, because they're, and I quote, focused on an illusion of best value achieved through competition. Would you like to disabuse him of that, or do you think there was an issue there? Daniel, want to start?
Oh, sorry, Daniel. Yes, go on.
Yeah, actually, with Daniel and Aaron, it's very different. You both can. So, Daniel, you start then.
Some of the solution is required at the start. You do need a detailed spec of the boundaries of your system, your service. You need to understand how it's going to interface to the other things, but you need to leave the specialist solution within the capacity of the supplier, because that's their job. That's what they're good at. We can't all know everything, and we need to put the capability in the right place. But you do need to bound the service, and that's what a lot of the guidance that we're going to talk about is trying to do, by setting out the standards and communications and links between components, so that the boundary can be put in place.
Yeah, okay, let's start my disabusing. I don't think the procurement guidelines or the procurement legislation that we operate in this country, basically the EU procurement legislation, it particularly drives you to any particular model of best value. I think the real aim of the procurement guidance is to ensure competition and access to markets. Local authorities often have very limited, very narrow views of what best value is, and that's something that they can change by culturally changing the way they work. But I don't think that's written into the procurement legislation. I think as long as you can demonstrate competition through many ways, and competitive dialogue, early involvement, negotiated procedures and design processes are all ways of doing that, are all ways of showing competition. And those routes do exist. They're not often used in the public sector. But then again, the public sector doesn't often buy the sorts of things we're now talking about. So, and again, this really is why we're here today, is because what we're saying is there are other ways of doing this. There are processes you can use. They're not commonly used at the moment in highway procurement, but they need to be.
Good. Well, I wanted you to say that because I have to declare an interest. I mean, I didn't introduce myself in detail to the audience, but when I was a member of the European Parliament, I was responsible for all the negotiations led to the EU procurement rules. So I can confirm exactly what you said, and that was certainly written into that. But I wanted to come back just to probe this issue about the definition of your unmet needs before you go to the marketplace. And this seems to be the issue. But we've had an interesting question that came in quite early on, if I can find it, about engaging with academic partners. And I mean, do you think that there is possibilities, of having some independent support and advice in helping to develop and understanding what your needs are before you go out into the marketplace? That seems to be a first point. And the second is and whether there are circumstances in which you may need to have some sort of partnership of suppliers who own different elements of technologies, because every application will be different. And looking at Daniel's big chart, that there could be different. You might have to actually find a system integrator of some kind to bring together the technologies to meet your specific requirement, and that's something that we should be training people to do. So I think so. Darren, do come back at me on that, because
I'm very pleased you used the word system integrator. I think that's something that's hugely lacking at the moment in the area of work we're in. Is people massively underestimate the need to think on a systems level and to think about systems integration. And actually, if you think about many of the big failures that we've seen recently, that the failure to deliver Crossrail on time wasn't our inability to dig tunnels or build trains; it was our inability to integrate systems. You think about things like the Boeing 737 Max. It wasn't any particular piece of technology that failed; it was a systems integration that failed. It's massively important. And as we move into more complex, multidisciplinary, multi-supplier procurements, that's increasingly a skill that we should be thinking about. We should be costing into projects. I think the earlier point about academic input, I think yes. Again, I think going back to this point about we need to think about the outcomes, and we need to think about how you measure the benefits of the outcomes, not just the fact you bought a thing. And again, this is about counting outputs and outcomes and the fact they're different. And I think an academic's view of how you measure benefit and how you would cost that, how you would assess the success or failure of a procurement, and how you would build that into whatever procurement process you use. I think that's pretty valuable, really. Yeah.
Okay. So Daniel, I mean, how might this be reflected in your work in terms of how we might partner people together and sort of preparing contracts? I mean, is this something that that you will be able to do? If somebody comes with a project and says, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to?
The intent of the guidance and the way we're structuring it is that it helps people break it down into the different components so that they can undertake the different procurements. The need for then a systems integrator to bring it together is, as Darren said, is going to be critical. And that to some extent that is more of an ongoing role than necessarily a project role, because as you procure different pieces, as the applications change, there's going to be a need to continue to update that service, so that it almost becomes an ongoing component of the process rather than a separate part of a project.
Yes. Now, there was somebody asked a question about a more structured approach to putting together expressions of interest. I mean, in some cases, you use prior information notices when you're putting out a tender, which then allows you to bring the potential suppliers together to discuss that. And is that something that you had experience with in terms of actually doing working with a prospective customer about doing this sort of pre-market engagement work before you go out to tender?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's something that we do quite often at the Catapult in supporting people with horizon scans, understanding what's there out in the market. We're doing it for several people at the moment as part of innovative procurement processes, and helping that process of understanding the opportunities and what people could bring, which then allows you to firm your specification before you go forward into procurement with an improved understanding of the risk.
Now, Sandra Hamilton's asked an interesting question, which is something that we are addressing, I can tell you, Sandra, at a level of Connected Places as well. Excuse me. So she says, wouldn't a centralised UK procurement knowledge hub make an important addition to the public infrastructure? And as she rightly says, its approach is already in place. As she says, in the Netherlands and Germany, there are at least 10 other countries that do it. And indeed, if you're interested, there is a European network of knowledge and innovation hubs called Procure 2, numerical 2 Innovate, you can find on the website. So I'm interested, Darren, particularly from government. I mean, do you think this is something that would be useful to do? I mean, is it something that should perhaps be focused on transport projects? Or should there be a more generic sort of best practice sharing operation going on to try and help local authorities to deal with these sort of issues?
I think they should. Whether we will end up with a formal body run by government, I think we may eventually, but I don't see that in the short term. I think in the short term, it's going to be about pieces of work like this. It's going to be about government bodies such as the Department of Transport working with the catapults. It's going to be about things like the Transport Technology Forum publishing guidance. It's going to be about doing it in those sort of ways and working with industry bodies as well. I think it's also worth mentioning, of course, that the Crown Commercial Service are there, and they are woefully underused by local authorities, and they are there to provide guidance, and they can provide guidance in a lot of issues like this, and they're not utilised anywhere near as much as they should be. And I think that's partly, well, I won't say their fault, but they maybe don't broadcast themselves as widely as it should. But that does sort of exist, but it's not. It doesn't have a snappy title, the one you just mentioned yet. And maybe it does. Maybe it needs that. Maybe we need that branding to bring all these services together to make it much easier for people to understand what is available out there.
Well, I think we need some resource to do it as well, to be fair. But anyway, we are working on some ideas. So if Sandra, if you want to send us some more ideas, or do have a look at the Procure to Innovate website, because we're clearly interested in that, you can get in touch with us and give us some more information.
And we can share the link of the TTF procurement guidance, can't we, Darren?
Absolutely, yeah, we can certainly share that. I'd be more than happy to do that. I think the other thing as well is there are other sectors we can look into. You know, the MOD do an awful lot of procurement guidance around defence procurement. It's a slightly different world, but there are principles that would read across. Similarly, Network Rail support suppliers in a different way for rail procurement than we do for roads procurement. There are, you know, the NHS has a whole raft of services to support procurement into the NHS. There are exemplars in other sectors that would read across and help maybe inspire us in roads technology.
Well, you really, this was leading into the question I was going to put, which is about Innovate UK, because of course Innovate UK does have the small business, the SBRI, the Small Business Research Initiative projects, and they have a team working with local authorities, and they have been supporting transport projects. And these are all projects that basically are run as I think Darren described as on a challenge procurement basis, where you're actually working with the potential suppliers to help develop that innovation to the customer's requirements. I wonder whether either of you had experience of working with Innovate UK, or is this something that you might recommend authorities to keep an eye out on the contests that are coming out of Innovate UK, to see whether they could get some funding to support some new initiatives? I don't know what your experience is for that. Daniel, have you worked on SBRI projects?
I've worked sort of alongside some. and more with the Transport Research Innovation grants that the Department of Transport runs. And they're definitely a way of generating some innovations and bringing them into the marketplace. I think there needs to be quite a clear process on the local authority side about how they're going to manage the end of the research and innovation process and move it from there into a ongoing operation so that it continues to deliver value.
Yeah. Darren?
Yeah, we work very closely with Innovate UK. So Innovate UK co-fund the Transport Technology Forum. They put up half the funding for that. I've just completed managing 3 SBRI projects through the department, and we actually have an event coming up in York on the 21st of October, which is showcasing those. And they were congestion challenge projects, so they were exactly in this space. They were about taking some quite low TRL, some quite low technology readiness level technology within suppliers, matching them with local authorities who have real world problems to solve, and then seeing how that develops. And that's been successful. I think you're quite right that the end of the project, how you turn it from the end of the project into a sellable product is tricky, and I don't really think anyone's solved that problem completely yet. But for me, and again, this goes back to an earlier point. For me, part of the interest in those is exemplars, working out good practice, working out what works well, and using that as part of the sort of wider engagement. But yeah, I think that's important. And I think the thing I would say about local authority involvement with Innovate projects is you often find there are lots of companies desperate to bid to innovate to run projects, but they quite often need public sector partners, and they're not easy to find. And I would encourage local authorities where applicable and where possible to form partnerships with SMEs, with technology providers, to help them deliver Innovate UK projects as a public sector partner. Partly because it makes the projects more worthwhile, having a public sector partner who can inject some real world problems and some real world issues into the project, keeps it more grounded and more realistic. And it also it helps certainly SMEs and startups and new entrants. It helps them into the sector more easily to have a local authority as a project partner. So I definitely recommend that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very encouraging. I mean, to hear that, and I think the real question is about communicating. Again, this is about the sort of networking and having more information exchange so that people are aware of what projects are going on. Because obviously we've worked in contact with a number of people with SBRIs, but in response to your point about the transition from the developing the solution, buying the research and development essentially, into the final contract. This is something that we've done a lot of work on in Challenge in CPC with the Challenging Procurement Program. And if anyone's interested, we wrote a long submission to the government in response to their green paper on procurement, which made that point. And we're hoping that will be listened to, because we suggested that under the new procurement rules, we actually have an improved version of the SBRI type legislation that allows that development to take place. But I think what it needs is for more attention to be paid to supporting those small enterprises that are successful in this crucial phase of scaling it up, because that's where they need external support and expertise and funding. To build their idea into a deliverable service, and particularly in something like transport, to meet all the quality, consistency, and 24-hour capability that will be required. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done there. Now, a couple of other questions which have come up, and in a way they link into what we've already talked about. But Peter is talking particularly about how you keep up with the pace of change in technology, and whether local authorities are worried about the fact that they might not be actually investing into the longer term technology because they don't necessarily have the foresight to see the way in which things are going. And that seems to be something that we, between us, so that from the department and particularly from Connected Places, need to be thinking about, giving them some reassurances and some directions in that area, I think. And Daniel, is that something you have in mind already?
Absolutely. I think it is a key part of the way that we're structuring things, about defining the interfaces so that you don't have to replace the whole thing, so that using standards, you're able to bring in new technologies as they become available. But on the other side of the picture is the risk of not doing anything can be as great as the risk of doing something.
Yes,
these other services that I talked about are moving. They are providing information to people who are using Google to manage their routes. If that doesn't interface to the way that you want your network to be used, then they're just going to follow the way that the Google's telling them.
Yes, we'll come back to that point. But Darren, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think it's a very good point. Do we want transport policy determined in County Hall, or do we want it determined in Sacramento? We do need to make sure that we are there, and local and public sector is involved in this. And it is tricky. Local authorities, as I said earlier, are spending public money, so we expect them to be risk averse to a certain degree. But I think it's beholden on government. It's beholden on people such as CPC to provide guidance where we can. As Daniel said, part of that is around ensuring that you procure in the wisest way possible to ensure you don't end up buying Betamax just as the rest of the world buys VHS. But I think there is a real inertia in local authorities, and there's a real concern about where we're going and where we should be spending money. And I think we really need to help with that. We really need to provide guidance around what that future should look like.
All right. Well, we've had a whole stack of ideas from this afternoon, which I know we've been making a note of, which I think will keep us busy for a long time to come, if we can afford to carry them out, that is. So Oliver Coltman has come back, which is a linked question, really, but I'll put it to you, because I just want to take us back to where we came in earlier in the questions, which is about how we're going to build expertise within the local authority teams, so that to make sure that they are being involved in these development projects. So maybe that's more internal training of the teams themselves about the tools that are available. But is this something that should be done on a more general basis, maybe with organisations like the local government authority? I know this is the Solace we work with, which I think is for local chief executives. There's one, I think, for transport, heads of transport in local authorities as well. I mean, should we be looking at new points of entry, do you think?
Yeah, so that body is ADEPT, the directors level body. There are bodies, say LGA and Solace, others. I think that there are a couple of points here. Firstly, we need to recognise that the day job of most local authority procurement officers will continue to be to buy stuff, and that won't change. And so we can't really expect local authorities to completely reconfigure themselves to go and buy an e-scooter management modelling solution, which they may do once every few years. We have to think about ways around that. And I think partly that's about getting local authorities, and this is where people like Solace come in, because they have a cross local authority view. So that the challenges that we're facing in transport are the same challenges, I imagine, that the housing department is facing around how you buy housing services. It's the same as the skills department, the education department is facing on education. So we need to think about outcomes that are similar, so that people in local authorities can think about procurement by category rather than by its end use, because that helps to sort of bring sort of resource and expertise together. The other thing is we should be increasingly encouraging, where possible, the involvement of combined authorities. So you procure a regional scale rather than a city scale. Again, that allows you to pool resource. Lead authority arrangements. This happens in some parts of the country and is a very good idea. Where one authority has the expertise, should that work on behalf of its neighbours? Again, defining exactly what the authority wants to achieve rather than the technology it wants to buy allows it to be easier for groups of authorities to see the commonality in the things that they're trying to procure and run joint procurements. I think expecting all 153 local authorities to go off and start procuring technology effectively is a big ask. I think supporting them to come together in various ways to procure jointly is probably a more healthy way of approaching this.
Yeah, Yeah. Yes, I mean, I agree with that. I think there are interesting differences between England and the devolved regions. So we know already, and we've had participants from Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland on these seminars, that they actually have a much more integrated policy. For example, in terms of sharing information, Wales has set up an SPRI competence centre, which is run out of a hospital where they've had great experience. And Oishi Kundu's put an interesting question in, which builds on what we were saying earlier about the potential for cross-sectoral learning. She's mentioned HSS, Defence, and with other departments. In other words, are there some core technologies here, particularly the ones that you're talking about in dealing with the really big data providers or processors, like Google, for example, where we should be disseminating that cross-functionally. It's not just exclusively a transport issue.
I think yes. I think that is a government level job. I think to find those cross-sector learnings and disseminate them. We can't expect local authorities to go out and start trying to speak to the MOD. It's just that's got to be government level thing. And I think again that it's not even about we're all buying the same technology. It's about we're all facing the same procurement challenges, about the move from buying capital resource to buying services, about buying things that we can define before we go to market, to buying things that we need to design as we're procuring them. It's all those challenges which are common across lots of sectors, I think. And I think absolutely we should, there is a real job for us to do to work out what works best in different sectors and try and deploy that.
Yeah. Daniel, do you want to add to
that? No, I think I would go back to the regional structures and working together that Darren was talking about earlier. I mean, it's always quite challenging when you talk about something like Wales, because the scale of the place is so small compared to the scale of England and the number of different authorities. So there's always going to be boundaries. There's always going to be different ways of doing something somewhere. But it's about sharing information across and sharing that best practice as best we can.
Good. So moving on, I think we can move on to some final questions. I just wanted to say to everybody who's answered questions, you may have noticed that our colleague Raj Wagiwala, who is our procurement expert in CPC, has been responding to some questions directly on technical points. So you're getting a double service from us today from CPC, and that's a great innovation for our seminar. So thanks, Raj, very much for doing that. I think this is the final question, unless anyone has any more questions. But this is from Ben Hawes. I wondered if you could both give us some what you regard as benchmark authorities, or people that are really good examples at the moment that we should be keeping an eye on. If I can just add to that, I mean, I know that London in particular in transport issues has been doing a lot of interesting work. And I'd just be interested to get your perspective on that. And then I have one other closing question to put before I invite you to give us your takeaway. But Daniel, is there somebody that you're working with, or is anything that stood out so far for you in terms of someone who's really doing this well?
There's just two that spring to mind. Oxford have been doing a lot of very good work around innovation procurement and involvement in lots of the SBRIs, in that they have a separate innovation panel who are involved in each procurement and work across different areas so that they're sharing information effectively. And the other one is York is doing lots of new stuff, as I'm sure Darren would support, and that is because of the historic way that they've built the connections between the senior leaders taking appropriate levels of risk. I think London is always a challenging example, again, because of scale. They have an awful lot more resources to draw on.
Yeah.
think
No.
I think Daniel's stolen my two obvious answers there. So I think again, just to add a little bit of background.
We can come and talk.
To add a little bit of background, I was at York for 18 years before joining DFT and ended as the transport systems manager there. So I'd like to take some maybe very small credit for the way York did stuff. But I mean, that was certainly around building a transport vision, around building an idea of what we wanted to achieve and what the interfaces were to allow us to break the procurement down into the right blocks to be able to procure and to be able to interlink things and build a combined system at the end of it. So that gave members an understanding of what we tried to buy and the market an understanding of what the challenges were. So, yeah, I think York is a good example. Oxford, I think it's actually Oxfordshire. It's the county that are very innovative and that have a separate company that do innovation. Transport for Greater Manchester again have a team who do quite far-thinking investigation into technology. They have a very clear understanding of where they want to get to. They have a very good risk appetite within the authority, which means they're very good at procurement technology. Some of the London boroughs, and I think you're right, TfL is a difficult one to think about because it works at a scale that means it can almost buy its own solutions, whether they're applicable elsewhere or not, which no other local authority in the UK has the luxury of doing. But I think certainly Greenwich similarly have a very active innovation team that they again have a spun out company dealing with that. Boroughs such as Islington again have a really strong link with parking providers. They have a really clear vision of how technology works in terms of parking. There are a number of exemplars, and I think again counties such as Lincolnshire have a great understanding of how to procure rural services. There are lots of different examples for lots of different sort of end uses really, and I think this is one of the jobs of the Transport Technology Forum is to start to do that, start to think about who those exemplars are and who we should be talking about. And I think again, we often talk about Oxfordshire, York, Greenwich. They are the kind of standard exemplars. We should be looking for other authorities that do things well. A final example, thinking about cities that you wouldn't really think about that have got lots of problems, lots of issues, but still do data procurement really well is Hull. Hull do this really well. They are probably applicable to lots of other similar cities with complex problems, complex budgetary problems, who are able to think about this in a very innovative way and get on do stuff. So there are lots of different examples in lots of different fields, I think.
That's been really great. Thank you for all of those. And I just want to recap. You said that York, there was going to be a public, is it a public event on the 21st of October?
There is, yeah.
And the results of some program. Okay, so.
Yep, so
can you send
yes, I can. Yeah, so basically 21st of October in York at the National Railway Museum. Who doesn't want to spend a day at the National Railway Museum? The Transport Technology Forum is hosting an event. So the way the Transport Technology Forum works is you don't have to join it. There is no membership. It's funded by DFT and Innovate UK. Anyone can attend. Our next event on the 21st in York is looking at the 3 congestion challenge SPRI projects we've funded. We're also going to release some new evaluation guidance that DFT has written for local authorities. Again, how you evaluate stuff and how you prove it's been a success is a key part of procurement. Certainly if you're thinking about risk reward models. So that would be very interesting, and it will be just a great day to get people together and start to sort of think about who's doing this well and make some linkages.
Okay.
So yes, we can share a link to that. Yeah.
So, but I think from the perspective of looking at procurement, then I'm not sure whether maybe that's something we could do something with the Transport Technology Forum to try and disseminate all of the procurement related issues, because a lot of them have come up today in the context of transport, but a lot of them are very applicable, as we've already discussed earlier, across different sectors as well. One of the things I wanted to, and this will be the last question, and then I just want to give you both an opportunity to leave us with a big idea, or you can have 2 if you like. But one of the things we haven't talked about, which is becoming more and more, I think, on the agenda for local authorities, and particularly in some areas, particularly in local transport issues, is how we involve citizens in this whole process of co-decision, or how do we get citizens' ideas and make them feel engaged with the sort of changes they want to see to improve their general life environment and their transport issues. And I just wonder whether you had experience of that, or whether it's an area where we need to develop some more ideas, or also find some good case studies.
I think,
who's going to start?
Do you want me to start that one? Again, I think this comes back to understanding what you're trying to buy. I think if the city says it wants to buy a new UTC system to manage traffic in the city centre, who cares? Who understands that? That's something the engineers will do. I think if the city says it wants to buy technology to make travel in the city centre better, and it wants to understand what better looks like, that's a way of engaging residents. Again, this is about understanding at a very high level what problem you're trying to solve with the thing you're trying to buy. And you need to do that. And certainly that was something we did in York, particularly around procuring bus information systems, was to think about, well, what do people want a better bus network to look like? What information do people want? What would be useful? Let's use that as a way of designing the procurement. And we were able to talk about it in those terms and say to people, you can help us design the solution the city buys. Then you can start to think about what the technology is, but start with that premise of what would work for the city. What does the city want to buy as a starting point? And that's where I think you can get other stakeholders, residents, and other groups involved.
Yeah, very good advice. Danny?
I was going to step back a bit behind the thinking about what you want to buy to the thinking about what you're trying to achieve. None of the technologies are delivering the outcomes directly. So to Darren's example of a UTC system, a UTC system can cause congestion if you set it up to achieve that, if that's what you want to do, or it can clear congestion. It could manage routes so that some routes are congested and some aren't. It's more about the transport strategy that you're trying to get the system to deliver. And so it's some of those aspects you can consult with the citizens on, though it is often challenging to explain the wider picture that you're trying to achieve. And particularly that comes true around areas like air quality, which are not visible. And how do you make the challenges of air quality and the implications of that actually accessible and visible to people so that they understand why you're trying to move traffic away from particular locations. That had a particular challenge that we had in a project I did in Ipswich, where the biggest air quality issue was around the bus station because of the buses and the location in the centre of town that was all canyoned. So you had to keep everything else away if you needed it to work.
Good. Okay. Well, I mean, I think we've had a really good session so far. So, and thank you very much indeed for all your questions and for all the extra information you've given us. So I'm just going to say to each of you, is there one specific point or one or two specific points you want to leave our audience with before we close? Daniel, do you want to start?
I would just back to the point we're making just now, really. It's starting with that strategy in mind, starting with the end in mind, if that isn't a little bit trite. And then doing the systems thinking. What are the implications, the connectivity between the different things that you're going to be changing?
Yeah. Daniel? Darren, sorry.
Darren. Yeah. For me, I think it goes back to something we talked about earlier. I think about not thinking about new procurement models as a sticking plaster to fix the reason your last procurement failed. If you want to think about using new ways of procuring, and you probably do, then that requires an institutional change, probably in how your organisation thinks about things. And it isn't right just to say, well, we want to buy the thing, we know what we want to buy, let's try and negotiate a process to do it. That won't work, or it certainly won't work efficiently. You need to fundamentally rethink the way that you design and procure things in order to start to use the sort of non-conventional procurement routes. And you do need to think about this as a sort of root and branch review of how you procure and use technology. Yeah.
I think very, very good advice. And I think particularly making your organisation really receptive to innovation. And I think certainly that's somebody made the point about Oxfordshire, where they have a focused team working on innovation projects, which will be good. But I mean, it's the scale of the organisation. So thank you both very much indeed. I think I'm now going to hand back to Oliver Kirsch, just to talk to you about our future programmes. When I think you've given us a lot of good ideas for that, and also we've got one more poll for you to close. So thanks very much to both our speakers, and I hand over to Oliver just for some closing remarks.
Fantastic, thank you very much, both Malcolm, Dan and Darren. That's a really interesting discussion, and I think there's some really strong reflections on the different parts of the innovation journey that we can support to really facilitate both the stimulation and the transition of new ideas into deployment. So that's really great, and as you say, Malcolm, that will lead to a lot of discussion following on from this. Nick, if you can pop up the third poll, please. So this is similar to the poll that we asked you earlier, but just to see, take the temperature on whether the discussion has changed any minds or taught us anything new. So the first question is the same: how important do you consider innovation procurement? And the second question is about how comprehensive the support that you're currently aware of is. So I guess we'll just give you a couple of moments to answer, and then if we can move to the results, Nick. So this is interesting. So the first question is unsurprising given the response earlier, and I'm glad to see that. Second, I can see that there is clearly appetite for more support and best practice sharing, which I hope that the manual for smart streets will begin to provide. And the feedback Dan described as running it through a beta version and developing and evolving that sounds like a really powerful model for trying to get the right advice rather than the easy advice to you. So thank you very much. That's again very helpful. Nick, if we can just flash up the final slide. So just for reference, as we mentioned earlier, we'll be circulating the slides and a recording of today's session to all attendees. But just to let you know, if you have any further questions or opportunities or discussion that you'd like to have in this space, please do feel free to get in touch. I think my email address personally was earlier on in the slide deck. And there is also a generic inbox that you can use, which is challenging procurement, all as one word, at cp.catapult.org.uk, which will come through to any of the team, and we will continue to talk to you. We'd love to welcome you to these future events that CPC is running. In particular, I would draw your attention to the item on the 24th of November, which is the next in our ongoing series of challenging procurement webinars, and we'll focus on housing retrofit as the particular subject area that we're looking to discuss at that point and share some best practice and some of the work that CPC has been undertaking. The registration for that is already open on our events page, the address at the bottom. And I would just mention that that session and our future sessions will be hosted by my colleague Raj, who's been on the call today and answering many questions, and Malcolm. And so we will look forward to welcoming you to